In 1933, a group of the wealthiest men in America walked into a room and decided to overthrow the President of the United States. Not metaphorically, not politically, physically, with soldiers, with weapons, with a plan that had been financed, staffed, and set in motion. The men in that room represented some of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. Among them, allies of J.P. Morgan, the DuPont family, and executives connected to Remington Arms. They needed a general. They found one. Major General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in American history at the time, was approached with an offer. Lead a private army of 500,000 veterans, march on Washington, remove Franklin Roosevelt from power, install a new government. Butler listened to every detail. Then he walked out of the meeting and went directly to the United States Congress. What happened next is one of the most important and most completely buried stories in American history, and you almost certainly have never heard it. To understand why the most powerful financial dynasty in America tried to overthrow a sitting president in 1933, you have to understand what Franklin Roosevelt had just done to them. It was the depths of the Great Depression. Banks had collapsed. A quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Families who had worked their entire lives had lost everything: savings, homes, futures, in a financial catastrophe that had been building since the crash of 1929. Roosevelt had been elected in 1932 on a promise to fix it, and unlike most politicians who make promises, he immediately began to act. Within his first 100 days, Roosevelt launched the New Deal: federal work programs, banking regulations, securities oversight, agricultural support, social safety nets. From the perspective of ordinary Americans, men and women who had lost everything, Roosevelt was a hero. From the perspective of the men whose financial empires depended on an unregulated system, Roosevelt was an existential threat. He had taken the United States off the gold standard, the same gold standard that banking dynasties had used for decades to control monetary policy. He had proposed the Glass-Steagall Act, which would separate commercial and investment banking, directly limiting the speculative activities that had made certain Wall Street firms extraordinarily powerful. He had looked directly at the men who had built their fortunes on an unregulated system and had said plainly that the system was going to change. The men who heard that message did not simply lobby against it. They did not simply fund political opponents. They planned a coup. The operation was called, in the accounts of those who later testified about it, the business plot. Its financial backbone came from a newly formed organization called the American Liberty League, founded in 1934 with significant funding from the DuPont family and executives connected to General Motors, Standard Oil, and the Morgan banking network. The Liberty League's public face was political opposition to the New Deal. Its private purpose, as revealed by subsequent congressional testimony, was considerably more direct.
I want you to hold two facts in your mind simultaneously. Fact 1. The men who planned this coup were not fringe radicals. They were not criminal outsiders. They were the same financial establishment, the same Morgan-connected, Wall Street-embedded network, whose descendants we have traced through every institution examined in this series. Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve, the Council on Foreign Relations, the same families, the same network. Fact 2. What they were planning was not political opposition. not legal challenge, not even aggressive lobbying. It was the violent overthrow of a democratically elected American government. In 1933, in the United States of America. And the only reason it did not happen, the only reason you are not living in the aftermath of a successful Wall Street coup, is because the general they approached turned out to be the wrong man for the job.
Major General Smedley Darlington Butler was not the kind of man the business plot organizers should have approached. He was, at the time of the approach, the most decorated Marine in American history. He had served in the Philippines, China, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, Haiti, and France. He had won the Medal of Honor twice, one of only 19 men in American history to receive it more than once. He was also, by 1933, a man who had begun to develop very specific views about the relationship between American military power and American financial interests. He would later write, in a pamphlet that became one of the most widely read anti-war documents in American history, that war is a racket, that he had spent 33 years as a high-class muscle man for big business, Wall Street, and the bankers. These were not the views of a man who would march on Washington to install a financial dictatorship. The approach came through Wall Street bond salesman named Gerald McGuire, who worked for Grace and Murphy, a director of Guaranty Trust, a Morgan-affiliated bank. McGuire told Butler the plan directly. A private army of veterans, funded by Wall Street money, would march on Washington. Roosevelt would be offered a choice: either accept a new position as a figurehead or be removed entirely. A new government, sympathetic to the financial establishment, would take control. McGuire told Butler the organizers had access to $3 million immediately, with more available, to fund the operation. Butler listened, asked questions, gathered as much detail as he could, and then he went to the FBI, who did little, and to the House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities, which at the time was investigating subversive threats to American democracy. Butler testified in November 1934. His testimony was explosive. He named names. He described the plan in precise detail. He identified the funding sources and the organizational structure. The committee investigated. It confirmed in its final report submitted to the full House of Representatives that Butler's testimony was credible, that the plot had been real, that the men he named had been involved. The committee's final report stated, and I am reading directly from the congressional record, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. The United States Congress officially confirmed that a group of Wall Street financiers had planned a coup against the President of the United States." Now, here is the question you are already asking. If the United States Congress officially confirmed that a coup had been planned by named, identified, wealthy, connected men, what happened to those men? Were they arrested? Were they charged? Were they prosecuted? Were their organizations dissolved? Were their assets seized? No. None of the men named in the congressional testimony faced any criminal charges whatsoever. The American Liberty League continued to operate until 1940. The DuPont family continued to run one of the largest industrial empires in America. The Morgan-connected banking network continued to operate, eventually, as we have already documented in this series, becoming embedded in the Federal Reserve System, the Council on Foreign Relations, and every major institution of American financial governance. The men who planned a coup against the President of the United States in 1933 faced no consequences. They waited. They reorganized. They continued. The mainstream press of 1934 did not treat Butler's testimony the way you might expect. The New York Times, one of the papers whose relationship with the CIA's Mockingbird program we have already documented, covered the story briefly and then dismissed it. An editorial described Butler's account as a gigantic hoax. Time magazine called it a plot without plotters. The same publications that were, within a decade, cooperating with intelligence agency influence programs were, in 1934, already running interference for the financial establishment that those programs were designed to protect. The business plot faded from public consciousness with remarkable speed. It was not included in most American history textbooks. It was not the subject of major documentary films or television investigations. The generation that grew up after World War II, your generation, was not taught that within living memory of their birth, the financial establishment of the United States had attempted to install a dictatorship. The business plot was conducted by journalist Sally Denton, whose 2012 book reconstructed the episode from congressional records, FBI files, and contemporary accounts. She found that the evidence was overwhelming, that Butler's testimony had been accurate in every verifiable detail, that the men he named had been exactly who he said they were, and that the reason the story had disappeared was not because it had been disproven. It was because the men involved were too important, too connected, too powerful, too embedded in the institutions of American financial and political life to be held publicly accountable without consequences that the system itself was not prepared to accept. The business plot was buried not by a conspiracy, but by the simple institutional logic of power protecting itself. The same logic we have documented in every episode of this series since the night of November 1910 on a private island off the coast of Georgia. Smedley Butler died in 1940. He never saw the men he named face any consequences for what they had planned, but he said something in testimony, in interviews, in the pamphlet he wrote, that has stayed with me through every episode of this series. He said that the real enemy of American democracy was never foreign, it was domestic. It was the intersection of money and power, the private financial interests that had learned over decades that it was cheaper and more effective to buy a government than to fight one, and that when buying failed, when a Roosevelt came along who could not be bought, the next option was always waiting. He knew because they had asked him to be the instrument of that option, and he had refused. There are not many Smedley Butlers in the history of American power. That is precisely why we need to know his name. The men who planned the business plot of 1933 did not disappear. They regrouped, they reinvested, they placed their people, as they always had, inside the institutions that govern American life. The Federal Reserve, the Council on Foreign Relations, the networks that supply every Secretary of State and CIA Director and Treasury Secretary that American democracy produces. The same families, the same money, the same patience. If you think the business plot was an isolated moment, a single desperate act by men who were never serious, consider this. The same network that funded the attempted coup of 1933 also funded, within the same decade, the rise of specific European political movements whose names you know very well. In our next episode, we follow that money to Europe, to the 1930s, to the banking dynasty that financed both sides of the most destructive war in human history and emerged from it more powerful than when it began. The Rothschild story is not what you have been told. It is more documented and more disturbing than anything that has circulated about them before. That story, next episode.